Chapter 7 of Mr. Standfast by John Buchan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. I Hear of the Wild Birds. I saw an old green felt hat, and below it lean tweed-clad shoulders. Then I saw a knapsack with a stick slung through it as the owner wriggled his way onto a shelf. Presently he turned his face upward to judge the remaining distance. It was the face of a young man, a face sallow and angular, but now a little flushed with the day's sun and the work of climbing. It was a face that I had first seen at Fosse Manor. I felt suddenly sick and heartsore. I don't know why, but I had never really associated the intellectuals of Biggleswick with a business like this. None of them but Ivery, and he was different. They had been silly and priggish, but no more. I would have taken my oath on it. Yet here was one of them engaged in black treason against his native land. Something began to beat in my temples when I remembered that Mary and this man had been friends, that he had held her hand and called her by her Christian name. My first impulse was to wait till he got up and then pitch him down among the boulders and let his German accomplices puzzle over his broken neck. With difficulty I kept down that tide of fury. I had my duty to do, and to keep on terms with this man was part of it. I had to convince him that I was an accomplice, and that might not be easy. I leaned over the edge, and as he got to his feet on the ledge above the boiler plates, I whistled so that he turned his face to me. "Hello, Wake," I said. He started, stared for a second, and recognized me. He did not seem over-pleased to see me. "Brand," he said, "how did you get here?" He swung himself up beside me, straightened his back, and unbuckled his knapsack. "I thought this was my own private sanctuary, and that nobody knew it but me. Have you spotted the cave? It's the best bedroom in Skye." His tone was, as usual, rather acid. That little hammer was beating in my head. I longed to get my hands on his throat and choke the smug treason in him. But I kept my mind fixed on one purpose, to persuade him that I shared his secret and was on his side. His offhand self-possession seemed only the clever screen of the surprised conspirator who was hunting for a plan. We entered the cave and he flung his pack into a corner. "Last time I was here," he said, "I covered the floor with heather. We must get some more of it if we would sleep soft." In the twilight he was a dim figure, but he seemed a new man from the one I had last seen in the Moot Hall at Biggleswick. What a fool I had been to set him down as no more than a conceited flaneur. He went out to the shelf again and sniffed the fresh evening. There was a wonderful red sky in the west, but in the crevice the shades had fallen, and only the bright patches at either end told of the sunset. "Wake," I said, "you and I have to understand each other. I'm a friend of Ivery, and I know the meaning of this place. I discovered it by accident, but I want you to know that I'm heart and soul with you. You may trust me in tonight's job as if I were Ivery himself." He swung round and looked at me sharply. His eyes were hot again, as I remembered them at our first meeting. "What do you mean? How much do you know?" The hammer was going hard in my forehead, and I had to pull myself together to answer. "I know that at the end of this crack a message was left last night, and that someone came out of the sea and picked it up. That someone is coming again when darkness falls, and there will be another message." He had turned his head away. "You are talking nonsense. No submarine could land on this coast." I could see that he was trying me. "This morning," I said, "I swam in the deep water inlet below us. It is the most perfect submarine shelter in Britain." He still kept his face from me, looking the way he had come. For a moment he was silent, and then he spoke in the bitter, drawling voice which had annoyed me at Fosse Manor. "How do you reconcile this business with your principles, Mr. Brand? You were always a patriot, I remember, though you didn't see eye to eye with the government." It was not quite what I expected, and I was unready. I stammered in my reply. "It's because I am a patriot that I want peace. I think that I mean—" "Therefore you are willing to help the enemy to win?" "They have already won. I want that recognized and the end hurried on." I was getting my mind clearer and continued fluently. "The longer the war lasts, the worse this country is ruined. We must make the people realize the truth." But he swung round suddenly, his eyes blazing. "You blackguard!" he cried. "You damnable blackguard!" And he flung himself on me like a wildcat. I had got my answer. He did not believe me, he knew me for a spy, and he was determined to do me in. We were beyond finesse now, and back at the old barbaric game. It was his life or mine. The hammer beat furiously in my head as we closed, and a fierce satisfaction rose in my heart. He never had a chance, for though he was in good trim and had the light, wiry figure of the mountaineer, he hadn't a quarter of my muscular strength. Besides, he was wrongly placed, for he had the outside station. Had he been on the inside, he might have toppled me over the edge by his sudden assault. As it was, I grappled him and forced him to the ground, squeezing the breath out of his body in the process. I must have hurt him considerably, but he never gave a cry. With a good deal of trouble I lashed his hands behind his back with the belt of my waterproof, carried him inside the cave, and laid him in the dark end of it. Then I tied his feet with the strap of his own knapsack. I would have to gag him, but that could wait. I had still to contrive a plan of action for the night, for I did not know what part he had been meant to play in it. He might be the messenger instead of the Portuguese Jew, in which case he would have papers about his person. If he knew of the cave, others might have the same knowledge, and I had better shift him before they came. I looked at my wristwatch, and the luminous dial showed me that the hour was 9:30. Then I noticed that the bundle in the corner was sobbing. It was a horrid sound, and it worried me. I had a little pocket electric torch, and I flashed it on Wake's face. If he was crying, it was with dry eyes. "What are you going to do with me?" he asked. "That depends," I said grimly. "Well, I'm ready. I may be a poor creature, but I'm damned if I'm afraid of you or anything like you." That was a brave thing to say, for it was a lie. His teeth were chattering. "I'm ready for a deal," I said. "You won't get it," was his answer. "Cut my throat if you mean to, but for God's sake don't insult me. I choke when I think about you. You come to us and we welcome you, and receive you in our houses, and tell you our inmost thoughts, and all the time you're a bloody traitor. You want to sell us to Germany. You may win now, but by God your time will come. That is my last word to you, you swine." The hammer stopped beating in my head. I saw myself suddenly as a blind, preposterous fool. I strode over to Wake, and he shut his eyes as if he expected a blow. Instead, I unbuckled the straps which held his legs and arms. "Wake, old fellow," I said, "I'm the worst kind of idiot. I'll eat all the dirt you want. I'll give you leave to knock me black and blue, and I won't lift a hand. But not now. Now we've another job on hand. Man, we're on the same side, and I never knew it. It's too bad a case for apologies, but if it's any consolation to you, I feel the lowest dog in Europe at this moment." He was sitting up, rubbing his bruised shoulders. "What do you mean?" he asked hoarsely. "I mean that you and I are allies. My name's not Brand. I'm a soldier, a general, if you want to know. I went to Biggleswick under orders, and I came chasing up here on the same job. Ivory's the biggest German agent in Britain, and I'm after him. I've struck his communication lines, and this very night, please God, we'll get the last clue to the riddle. You hear? We're in this business together, and you've got to lend a hand." I told him briefly the story of Gresson, and how I had tracked his man here. As I talked, we ate our supper, and I wish I could have watched Wake's face. He asked questions, for he wasn't convinced in a hurry. I think it was my mention of Mary Lamington that did the trick. I don't know why, but that seemed to satisfy him. But he wasn't going to give himself away. "You may count on me," he said, "for this is black, blackguardly treason. But you know my politics, and I don't change them for this. I'm more against your accursed war than ever, now that I know what war involves." "Right-o," I said. "I'm a pacifist myself. You won't get any heroics about war from me. I'm all for peace, but we've got to down those devils first." It wasn't safe for either of us to stick in that cave, so we cleared away the marks of our occupation and hid our packs in a deep crevice on the rock. Wake announced his intention of climbing the tower while there was still a faint afterglow of light. "It's broad on the top, and I can keep a watch out to see if any light shows. I've been up it before. I found the way 2 years ago. No, I won't fall asleep and tumble off. I slept most of the afternoon on the top of Skouervik, and I'm as wakeful as a bat now." I watched him shin up the face of the tower, and admired greatly the speed and neatness with which he climbed. Then I followed the crevice southward to the hollow just below the platform where I had found the footmarks. There was a big boulder there, which partly shut off the view of it from the direction of our cave. The place was perfect for my purpose, for between the boulder and the wall of the tower was a narrow gap, through which I could hear all that passed on the platform. I found a stance where I could rest in comfort and keep an eye through the crack on what happened beyond. There was still a faint light on the platform, but soon that disappeared, and black darkness settled down on the hills. It was the dark of the moon, and, as happened the night before, a thin wrack blew over the sky, hiding the stars. The place was very still, though now and then would come the cry of a bird from the crags that beetled above me, and from the shore the pipe of a tern or oyster-catcher. An owl hooted from somewhere up on the tower. That I recognized was Wake, so I hooted back and was answered. I unbuckled my wrist-watch and pocketed it, lest its luminous dial should betray me, and I noticed that the hour was close on 11. I had already removed my shoes, and my jacket was buttoned at the collar so as to show no shirt. I did not think that the coming visitor would trouble to explore the crevice beyond the platform, but I wanted to be prepared for emergencies. Then followed an hour of waiting. I felt wonderfully cheered and exhilarated, for Wake had restored my confidence in human nature. In that eerie place we were wrapped round with mystery like a fog. Some unknown figure was coming out of the sea, the emissary of that power we had been at grips with for 3 years. It was as if the war had just made contact with our own shores, and never, not even when I was alone in the South German forest, had I felt so much the sport of whimsical fate. I only wished Peter could have been with me. And so my thoughts fled to Peter and his prison camp, and I longed for another sight of my old friend, as a girl longs for her lover. Then I heard the hoot of an owl, and presently the sound of careful steps fell on my ear. I could see nothing, but I guessed it was the Portuguese Jew, for I could hear the grinding of heavily nailed boots on the gritty rock. The figure was very quiet. It appeared to be sitting down, and then it rose and fumbled with the wall of that tower just beyond the boulder behind which I sheltered. It seemed to move a stone and to replace it. After that came silence, and then once more the hoot of an owl. There were steps on the rock staircase, the steps of a man who did not know the road well and stumbled a little. Also they were the steps of one without nails in his boots. They reached the platform and someone spoke. It was the Portuguese Jew, and he spoke in good German. "Die Vögelein schweigen im Walde," he said. The answer came from a clear, authoritative voice. "Warte nur, balde ruhest du auch." Clearly some kind of password, for sane men don't talk about little birds in that kind of situation. It sounded to me like indifferent poetry. Then followed a conversation in low tones, of which I only caught odd phrases. I heard 2 names, Chelius and what sounded like a Dutch word, Bommerts. Then to my joy I caught Elfenbein, and when uttered it seemed to be followed by a laugh. I heard too a phrase, several times repeated, which seemed to me pure gibberish, Die Stubenvögel verstehen. It was spoken by the man from the sea. And then the word Wildvögel. The pair seemed demented about birds. For a second an electric torch was flashed in the shelter of the rock, and I could see a tanned, bearded face looking at some papers. The light disappeared, and again the Portuguese Jew was fumbling with the stones at the base of the tower. To my joy he was close to my crack, and I could hear every word. "You cannot come here very often," he said, "and it may be hard to arrange a meeting. See, therefore, the place I have made to put the Vögelfutter. When I get a chance I will come here, and you will come also when you are able. Often there will be nothing, but sometimes there will be much." My luck was clearly in, and my exultation made me careless. A stone on which a foot rested slipped, and though I checked myself at once, the confounded thing rolled down into the hollow, making a great clatter. I plastered myself in the embrasure of the rock and waited with a beating heart. The place was pitch dark, but they had an electric torch, and if they once flashed it on me I was gone. I heard them leave the platform and climb down into the hollow. There they stood listening while I held my breath. Then I heard, "Nix, mein Freund," and the 2 went back, the naval officer's boots slipping on the gravel. They did not leave the platform together. The man from the sea bade a short farewell to the Portuguese Jew, listening, I thought, impatiently to his final message, as if eager to be gone. It was a good half hour before the latter took himself off, and I heard the sound of his nailed boots die away as he reached the heather of the moor. I waited a little longer and then crawled back to the cave. The owl hooted, and presently Wake descended lightly beside me. He must have known every foothold and handhold by heart to do the job in that inky blackness. I remember that he asked no question of me, but he used language rare on the lips of conscientious objectors about the men who had lately been in the crevice. We, who 4 hours earlier had been at death grips, now curled up on the hard floor like two tired dogs and fell sound asleep. I woke to find Wake in a thundering bad temper. The thing he remembered most about the night before was our scrap and the gross way I had insulted him. I didn't blame him, for if any man had taken me for a German spy, I would have been out for his blood, and it was no good explaining that he had given me grounds for suspicion. He was as touchy about his blessed principles as an old maid about her age. I was feeling rather extra buckish myself, and that didn't improve matters. His face was like a gargoyle as we went down to the beach to bathe, so I held my tongue. He was chewing the cud of his wounded pride. But the salt water cleared out the dregs of his distemper. You couldn't be peevish swimming in that jolly shining sea. We raced each other away beyond the inlet to the outer water, which a brisk morning breeze was curling, then back to a promontory of heather, where the first beams of the sun coming over the Coolin dried our skins. He sat hunched up staring at the mountains, while I prospected the rocks at the edge. Out in the Minch, 2 destroyers were hurrying southward, and I wondered where in that waste of blue was the craft which had come here in the night watches. I found the spoor of the man from the sea quite fresh on a patch of gravel above the tide mark. "There's our friend of the night," I said. "I believe the whole thing was a whimsy," said Wake, his eyes on the chimney of Sgurr Dearg. "They were only 2 natives, poachers perhaps, or tinkers." "They don't speak German in these parts." "It was Gaelic, probably." "What do you make of this, then?" and I quoted the stuff about birds with which they had greeted each other. Wake looked interested. "That's Über allen Gipfeln. Have you ever read Goethe?" "Never a word. And what do you make of that?" I pointed to a flat rock below tide mark, covered with a tangle of seaweed. It was of a softer stone than the hard stuff of the hills, and someone had scraped off half the seaweed and a slice of the side. "That wasn't done yesterday morning, for I had my bath here." Wake got up and examined the place. He nosed about in the crannies of the rocks lining the inlet, and got into the water again to explore better. When he joined me, he was smiling. "I apologize for my scepticism," he says. "There's been some petrol-driven craft here in the night. I can smell it, for I have a nose like a retriever. I dare say you're on the right track. Anyhow, though you seem to know a bit about German, you could scarcely invent immortal poetry." We took our belongings to a green crook of the burn and made a very good breakfast. Wake had nothing in his pack but plasmon biscuits and raisins, for that, he said, was his mountaineering provender, but he was not averse to sampling my tinned stuff. He was a different-sized fellow out in the hills from the anaemic intellectual of Biggleswick. He had forgotten his beastly self-consciousness and spoke of his hobby with a serious passion. It seemed he had scrambled about everywhere in Europe, from the Caucasus to the Pyrenees. I could see he must be good at the job, for he didn't brag of his exploits. It was the mountains that he loved, not wriggling his body up hard places. The Coolin, he said, were his favourites, for on some of them you could get 2,000 feet of good rock. We got our glasses on the face of Sgurr Alister, and he sketched out for me the various ways of getting to its grim summit. The Coolin and the Dolomites for him, for he had grown tired of the Chamonix Aiguille. I remember he described with tremendous gusto the joys of early dawn in Tyrol, when you ascended through acres of flowery meadows to a tooth of clean white limestone against a clean blue sky. He spoke, too, of the little wild hills in the Bavarian Wettersteingebirge, and of a guide he had picked up there and trained to do the job. They called him Sebastian Buchwieser. He was the jolliest boy you ever saw, and as clever on crags as a chamois. He's probably dead by now, dead in a filthy Jaeger battalion. That's you and your accursed war. "Well, we've got to get busy and end it in the right way," I said, "and you've got to help, my lad." He was a good draftsman, and with his assistance I drew a rough map of the crevice where we had roosted for the night, giving its bearings carefully in relation to the burn and the sea. Then I wrote down all the details about Gresson and the Portuguese Jew, and described the latter in minute detail. I described, too, most precisely, the cache where it had been arranged that the messages should be placed. That finished my stock of paper, and I left the record of the oddments overheard of the conversation for a later time. I put the thing in an old leather cigarette case I possessed and handed it to Wake. "You've got to go straight off to the Kyle and not waste any time on the way. Nobody suspects you, so you can travel any road you please. When you get there, you ask for Mr. Andrew Amos, who has some government job in the neighbourhood. Give him that paper from me. He'll know what to do with it all right. Tell him I'll get somehow to the Kyle before midday the day after tomorrow. I must cover my tracks a bit, so I can't come with you, and I want that thing in his hands just as fast as your legs will take you. If anyone tries to steal it from you, for God's sake eat it. You can see for yourself that it's devilish important." "I shall be back in England in 3 days," he said. "Any message for your other friends?" "Forget all about me. You never saw me here. I'm still Brand, the amiable colonial studying social movements. If you meet Ivory, say you heard of me on the Clyde, deep in sedition. But if you see Miss Lamington, you can tell her I'm past the hill difficulty. I'm coming back as soon as God will let me, and I'm going to drop right into the Biggleswick push. Only this time I'll be a little more advanced in my views. You needn't get cross. I'm not saying anything against your principles. The main point is that we both hate dirty treason." He put the case in his waistcoat pocket. "I'll go round Garsbane," he said, "and over by Camisonary. I'll be at the Kyle long before evening. I meant anyhow to sleep at Broadford tonight. Goodbye, Brand, for I've forgotten your proper name. You're not a bad fellow, but you've landed me in melodrama for the first time in my sober existence. I have a grudge against you for mixing up the Coolin with a shilling shocker. You've spoiled their sanctity." "You've got the wrong notion of romance," I said. "Why, man, last night for an hour you were in the front line, the place where the enemy forces touch our own. You were over the top. You were in no man's land." He laughed. "That is one way to look at it." And then he stalked off, and I watched his lean figure till it was round the turn of the hill. All that morning I smoked peacefully by the burn, and let my thoughts wander over the whole business. I had got precisely what Blenkiron wanted, a post office for the enemy. It would need careful handling, but I could see the juiciest lies passing that way to the Grosses Hauptquartier. Yet I had an ugly feeling at the back of my head that it had all been too easy, and that Ivory was not the man to be duped in this way for long. That set me thinking about the queer talk on the crevice. The poetry stuff I dismissed as the ordinary password, probably changed every time. But who were Helios and Bommaerts, and what in the name of goodness were the wild birds and the cage birds? Twice in the past 3 years I had had 2 such riddles to solve, Scudder's scribble in his pocket-book and Harry Bullivant's 3 words. I remembered how it had only been by constant chewing at them that I had got a sort of meaning, and I wondered if fate would some day expound this puzzle also. Meanwhile I had to get back to London as inconspicuously as I had come. It might take some doing, for the police, who had been active in Morven, might be still on the track, and it was essential that I should keep out of trouble and give no hint to Gresson and his friends that I had been so far north. However, that was for Amos to advise me on, and about noon I picked up my waterproof with its bursting pockets and set off on a long detour up the coast. All that blessed day I scarcely met a soul. I passed a distillery which seemed to have quit business, and in the evening came to a little town on the sea where I had a bed and supper in a superior kind of public house. Next day I struck southward along the coast and had 2 experiences of interest. I had a good look at Ranna and observed that the Tobermory was no longer there. Gresson had only waited to get his job finished. He could probably twist the old captain any way he wanted. The second was that at the door of a village smithy I saw the back of the Portuguese Jew. He was talking Gaelic this time, good Gaelic it sounded, and in that knot of idlers he would have passed for the ordinariest kind of gillie. He did not see me, and I had no desire to give him the chance, for I had an odd feeling that the day might come when it would be good for us to meet as strangers. That night I put up boldly in the inn at Broadford, where they fed me nobly on fresh sea trout, and I first tasted an excellent liqueur made of honey and whisky. Next morning I was early afoot, and well before midday was in sight of the narrows of the Kyle and the two little stone clachans which face each other across the strip of sea. About 2 miles from the place at a turn of the road I came upon a farmer's gig, drawn up by the wayside, with the horse cropping the moorland grass. A man sat on the bank smoking, with his left arm hooked in the reins. He was an oldish man with a short square figure, and a woolen comforter enveloped his throat. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Mr. Standfast by John Buchan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. The Adventures of a Bagman. "You're punctual to time, Mr. Brand," said the voice of Amos, "but losh, man, what have ye done to your breeks? And your wits? You're no just very respectable in your appearance." I wasn't. The confounded rocks of the Coolin had left their mark on my shoes, which moreover had not been cleaned for a week, and the same hills had rent my jacket at the shoulders and torn my trousers above the right knee and stained every part of my apparel with peat and lichen. I cast myself on the bank beside Amos and lit my pipe. "Did you get my message?" I asked. "Aye, it's gone by a sure hand to the destination we ken of. Ye've managed well, Mr. Brand, but I wish ye were back in London." He sucked at his pipe, and the shaggy brows were pulled so low as to hide the wary eyes. Then he proceeded to think aloud. "You canna go back by Mallaig. I don't just understand why, but they're looking for you down that line. It's a vexatious business when your friends, meaning the police, are doing their best to upset your plans, and you no able to enlighten them. I could send word to the chief constable and get ye through to London without a stop like a load of fish from Aberdeen, but that would be spoiling the fine character you've been at such pains to construct. Na, ye maun take the risk and travel by Muirtown without any credentials." "It can't be a very big risk," I interpolated. "I'm no so sure. Gresson's left the Tobermory. He went by here yesterday on the Mallaig boat, and there was a wee black-avised man with him that got out at Kyle. He's there still, stopping at the hotel. They ca' him Linklater, and he travels in whisky. I don't like the looks of him." "But Gresson does not suspect me?" "Maybe no, but you wouldna like him to see you hereaways. You gentry don't leave muckle to chance. Be very certain that every man in Gresson's lot kens all about ye, and has your description down to the mole on your chin." "Then they've got it wrong," I replied. "I was speaking figuratively," said Amos. "I was considering your case the feck of yesterday, and I brought the best I could do for ye in the gig. I wish ye were more respectable clad, but a good topcoat will hide deficiencies." From behind the gig seat he pulled out an ancient Gladstone bag and revealed its contents. There was a bowler of a vulgar and antiquated style. There was a ready-made overcoat of some dark cloth, of the kind that a clerk wears on the road to the office. There was a pair of detachable celluloid cuffs, and there was a linen collie and dicky. Also there was a small hand case, such as bagmen carry on their rounds. "That's your luggage," said Amos with pride. "That wee bag's full of samples. Ye'll mind I took the precaution of measuring ye in Glasgow, so the things'll fit. You've got a new name, Mr. Brand, and I've taken a room for ye in the hotel on the strength of it. You're Archibald McCaskey, and you're travelling for the firm of Todd, Sons and Brothers of Edinburgh. You ken the folk? They publish wee religious books that you've been trying to sell for Sabbath schools prizes to the Free Kirk ministers in Skye." The notion amused Amos, and he relapsed into the sombre chuckle which for him did duty for a laugh. I put my hat and waterproof in the bag and donned the bowler and the topcoat. They fitted fairly well. Likewise the cuffs and collar, though here I struck a snag, for I had lost my scarf somewhere in the Coolin, and Amos, pelican-like, had to surrender the rusty black tie which adorned his own person. It was a queer rig, and I felt like nothing on earth in it, but Amos was satisfied. "Mr. McCaskey, sir," he said, "you're the very model of a publisher's traveller. You'd better learn a few biographical details which ye may be forgotten. You're an Edinburgh man, but ye were some years in London, which explains the way ye speak. Ye bide at 6 Russell Street, off the Meadows, and ye're an elder in the Nethergate U.F. Kirk. Have ye ony special taste ye could lead the crack on to if you're engaged in conversation?" I suggested the English classics. "And very suitable. Ye can try politics too. Ye'd better be a free trader, but converted by Lloyd George. That's a common case, and ye'll need to be by ordinary common. If I was you, I would daunder about here for a bit, and no arrive at your hotel till after dark. Then ye can have your supper and gang to bed. The Muirtown train leaves at 7:30 in the morning. Nah, ye can't come with me. It wouldna do for us to be seen together. If I meet ye in the street, I'll never let on I know ye." Amos climbed into the gig and jolted off home. I went down to the shore and sat among the rocks, finishing about tea-time the remains of my provisions. In the mellow gloaming I strolled into the clachan and got a boat to put me over to the inn. It proved to be a comfortable place, with a motherly old landlady who showed me to my room and promised ham and eggs and cold salmon for supper. After a good wash, which I needed, and an honest attempt to make my clothes presentable, I descended to the meal in a coffee room lit by a single dim paraffin lamp. The food was excellent, and as I ate, my spirits rose. In 2 days I should be back in London beside Blenkiron, and somewhere within a day's journey of Mary. I could picture no scene now without thinking how Mary fitted into it. For her sake I held Biggleswick delectable, because I had seen her there. I wasn't sure if this was love, but it was something I had never dreamed of before, something which I now hugged the thought of. It made the whole earth rosy and golden for me, and life so well worth living that I felt like a miser towards the days to come. I had about finished supper when I was joined by another guest. Seen in the light of that infamous lamp, he seemed a small, alert fellow with a bushy black moustache and black hair parted in the middle. He had fed already and appeared to be hungering for human society. In 3 minutes he had told me that he had come down from Portree and was on his way to Leith. A minute later he had whipped out a card on which I read J. Linklater, and in the corner the name of Hatherwick Brothers. His accent betrayed that he hailed from the west. "I've been up among the distilleries," he informed me. "It's a poor business distilling in these times, with the teetotallers yowling about the nation's shame and the way to lose the war. I'm a temperate man myself, but I would think shame to spile decent folks' business. If the government want to stop the drink, let them buy us out. They've permitted us to invest good money in the trade, and they must see that we get it back. The other way will wreck public credit. That's what I say. Supposing some Labour government takes the notion that soap's bad for the nation, are they going to shut up port sunlight, or good clothes, or lum hats? There's no end to their daftness if they want to start on that track. A lawful trade's a lawful trade, says I, and it's contrary to public policy to pit it at the mercy of wheen cranks. Do you no agree, sir? By the way, I haven't got your name." I told him, and he rambled on. "We're blenders and do a very high-class business, mostly foreign. The war's hit us with our export trade, of course, but we're no as bad as some. What's your line, Mr. McCaskey?" When he heard, he was keenly interested. "D'you say so? You're from Todd's? Man, I was in the book business myself, till I changed it for something a wee bit more lucrative. I was on the road for 3 years for Andrew Matheson. You ken the name, Paternoster Row? I've forgotten the number. I had a kind of ambition to start a bookselling shop of my own and to make Linklater of Paisley a big name in the trade. But I got the offer from Hatherwick's, and I was wanting to get married, so filthy lucre won the day. And I'm no sorry I changed. If it hadn't have been for this war, I would have been making 4 figures of my salary and commissions. My pipe's out. Have you one of those rare and valuable curiosities called a spunk, Mr. McCaskey?" He was a merry little grig of a man, and he babbled on, till I announced my intention of going to bed. If this was Amos's bagman, who had been seen in company with Gresson, I understood how idle may be the suspicions of a clever man. He had probably foregathered with Gresson on the Skye boat, and wearied that saturnine soul with his cackle. I was up betimes, paid my bill, ate a breakfast of porridge and fresh haddock, and walked the few hundred yards to the station. It was a warm, thick morning with no sun visible, and the Skye hills misty to their base. The 3 coaches on the little train were nearly filled when I had bought my ticket, and I selected a third-class smoking carriage which held 4 soldiers returning from leave. The train was already moving when a late passenger hurried along the platform and clambered in beside me. A cheery "Mornin', Mr. McCaskie," revealed my fellow guest at the hotel. We jolted away from the coast, up a broad glen, and then on to a wide expanse of bog with big hills showing towards the north. It was a drowsy day, and in that atmosphere of shag and crowded humanity I felt my eyes closing. I had a short nap and woke to find that Mr. Linklater had changed his seat and was now beside me. "We'll no get a Scotsman till Muirtown," he said. "Have you nothing in your samples you could give me to read?" I had forgotten about the samples. I opened the case and found the oddest collection of little books, all in gay bindings. Some were religious, with names like Dew of Herman and Cool Siloam. Some were innocent narratives, How Tommy Saved His Pennies, A Missionary Child in China, and Little Susie and Her Uncle. There was a Life of David Livingstone, a child's book on seashells, and a richly gilt edition of the poems of one James Montgomery. I offered the selection to Mr. Linklater, who grinned and chose The Missionary Child. "It's not the reading I'm accustomed to," he said. "I like strong meat, Hall Caine and Jack London. By the way, how do you square this business of yours with the booksellers? When I was in Matheson's there would have been trouble if we had dealt direct with the public like you." The confounded fellow started to talk about the details of the book trade, of which I knew nothing. He wanted to know on what terms we sold juveniles, and what discount we gave the big wholesalers, and what class of book we put out on sale. I didn't understand a word of his jargon, and I must have given myself away badly, for he asked me questions about firms of which I had never heard, and I had to make some kind of answer. I told myself that the donkey was harmless, and that his opinion of me mattered nothing, but as soon as I decently could I pretended to be absorbed in the Pilgrim's Progress, a gaudy copy of which was among the samples. It opened at the episode of Christian and Hopeful in the Enchanted Ground, and in that stuffy carriage I presently followed the example of Heedless and Too Bold and fell sound asleep. I was awakened by the train rumbling over the points of a little moorland junction. Sunk in a pleasing lethargy, I sat with my eyes closed, and then covertly took a glance at my companion. He had abandoned The Missionary Child, and was reading a little dun-coloured book and marking passages with a pencil. His face was absorbed, and it was a new face, not the vacant, good-humoured look of the garrulous bagman, but something shrewd, purposeful, and formidable. I remained hunched up as if still sleeping, and tried to see what the book was. But my eyes, good as they are, could make nothing out of the text or title, except that I had a very strong impression that that book was not written in the English tongue. I woke abruptly and leaned over to him. Quick as lightning, he slid his pencil up his sleeve and turned on me with a fatuous smile. "What do you make of this, Mr. McCaskie? It's a wee book I picked up at a roup along with 50 others. I paid 5 shillings for the lot. It looks like German, but in my young days they didn't teach us foreign languages." I took the thing and turned over the pages, trying to keep any sign of intelligence out of my face. It was German right enough, a little manual of hydrography with no publisher's name on it. It had the look of the kind of textbook a government department might issue to its officials. I handed it back. "It's either German or Dutch. I'm not much of a scholar, barring a little French and the Latin I got at Heriot's Hospital. This is an awful slow train, Mr. Linklater." The soldiers were playing nap, and the bagman proposed a game of cards. I remembered in time that I was an elder in the Nethergate U.F. Church, and refused with some asperity. After that I shut my eyes again, for I wanted to think out this new phenomenon. The fellow knew German, that was clear. He'd also been seen in Gresson's company. I didn't believe he suspected me, though I suspected him profoundly. It was my business to keep strictly to my part, and give him no cause to doubt me. He was clearly practising his own part on me, and I must appear to take him literally on his professions. So presently I woke up and engaged him in a disputatious conversation about the morality of selling strong liquors. He responded readily, and put the case for alcohol with much pointed vehemence. The discussion interested the soldiers, and one of them, to show he was on Linklater's side, produced a flask and offered him a drink. I concluded by observing morosely that the bagman had been a better man when he peddled books for Alexander Matheson, and that put the closure on the business. That train was a record. It stopped at every station, and in the afternoon it simply got tired and sat down in the middle of a moor and reflected for an hour. I stuck my head out of the window now and then and smelt the rooty fragrance of bogs, and when we halted on a bridge I watched the trout in the pools of the brown river. Then I slept and smoked alternately and began to get furiously hungry. Once I woke to hear the soldiers discussing the war. There was an argument between a lance corporal and the Camerons and a sapper private about some trivial incident on the Somme. "I tell ye I was there," said the Cameron. "We were relieving the Black Watch and Fritz was shelling the road and we didna get up to the line till 1 o'clock in the morning. Frae Frickout Circus to the south end of the High Woods is every bit of 5 mile." "Not aboon 3, said the sapper dogmatically. "Man, I've tramped it." "Same here. I took up wire every nicht for a week." The Cameron looked moodily round the company. "I wish there was another man here that kent the place. He would bear me out. These boys are no good, for they didna join till later. I tell ye, it's 5 mile." "3, said the sapper. Tempers were rising, for each of the disputants felt his veracity assailed. It was too hot for a quarrel, and I was so drowsy that I was heedless. "Shut up, you fools," I said. "The distance is 6 kilometres, so you're both wrong." My tone was so familiar to the men that it stopped the wrangle, but it was not the tone of a publisher's traveller. Mr. Linklater cocked his ears. "What's a kilometre, Mr. McCaskey?" he asked blandly. "Multiply by 5 and divide by 8 and you get the miles." I was on my guard now, and told a long story of a nephew who had been killed on the Somme, and how I had corresponded with the War Office about his case. "Besides," I said, "I'm a great student of the newspapers, and I've read all the books about the war. It's a difficult time, this, for us all, and if you can take a serious interest in the campaign it helps a lot. I mean working out the places on the map and reading Haig's dispatches." "Just so," he said dryly, and I thought he watched me with an odd look in his eyes. A fresh idea possessed me. This man had been in Gresson's company, he knew German, he was obviously something very different from what he professed to be. What if he were in the employ of our own secret service? I had appeared out of the void at the Kyle, and I had made but a poor appearance as a bagman, showing no knowledge of my own trade. I was in an area interdicted to the ordinary public, and he had good reason to keep an eye on my movements. He was going south, and so was I. Clearly, we must somehow part company. "We change at Muirtown, don't we?" I asked. "When does the train for the south leave?" He consulted a pocket timetable. 10:33. There's generally 4 hours to wait, for we're due in at 6:15, but this old hearse will be lucky if it's in by 9. His forecast was correct. We rumbled out of the hills into the haughlands and caught a glimpse of the North Sea. Then we were hung up while a long goods train passed down the line. It was almost dark when at last we crawled into Muirtown station and disgorged our load of hot and weary soldiery. I bade an ostentatious farewell to Linklater. "Very pleased to have met you. I'll see you later on the Edinburgh train. I'm for a walk to stretch my legs and a bite of supper." I was very determined that the 10:30 for the south should leave without me. My notion was to get a bed and a meal in some secluded inn, and walk out next morning and pick up a slow train down the line. Linklater had disappeared towards the guard's van to find his luggage, and the soldiers were sitting on their packs with that air of being utterly and finally lost and neglected which characterises the British fighting man on a journey. I gave up my ticket, and since I had come off a northern train, walked unhindered into the town. It was market night, and the streets were crowded. Blue jackets from the fleet, country folk in to shop, and every kind of military detail thronged the pavements. Fish hawkers were crying their wares, and there was a tatterdemalion piper making the night hideous at a corner. I took a tortuous route and finally fixed on a modest-looking public house on a back street. When I inquired for a room, I could find no one in authority, but a slatternly girl informed me that there was one vacant bed and that I could have ham and eggs in the bar. So after hitting my head violently against a crossbeam, I stumbled down some steps and entered a frowsty little place smelling of spilt beer and stale tobacco. The promised ham and eggs proved impossible. There were no eggs to be had in Muirtown that night, but I was given cold mutton and a pint of indifferent ale. There was nobody in the place but two farmers drinking hot whisky and water, and discussing with sombre interest the rise in the price of feeding stuffs. I ate my supper, and was just preparing to find the whereabouts of my bedroom when through the street door there entered a dozen soldiers. In a second the quiet place became a Babel. The men were strictly sober, but they were in that temper of friendliness which demands a libation of some kind. One was prepared to stand treat. He was the leader of the lot, and it was to celebrate the end of his leave that he was entertaining his pals. From where I sat I could not see him, but his voice was dominant. "What's your fancy, Jock? Beer for you, Andra?" "A pint and a dram for me. This is better than Vong Blong and Vong Rouge, Davy. Man, when I'm sitting in those estaments, as they call them, I often long for a good Scots public." The voice was familiar. I shifted my seat to get a view of the speaker, and then I hastily withdrew back. It was the Scots Fusilier I had clipped on the jaw in defending Gresson after the Glasgow meeting. But by a strange fatality he had caught sight of me. "Wha's that at the corner?" he cried, leaving the bar to stare at me. Now, it is a queer thing, but if you have once fought with a man, though only for a few seconds, you remember his face, and the scrap in Glasgow had been under a lamp. The Jock recognised me well enough. "By God," he cried, "if this is no a bit of luck. Boys, here's the man I fought with in Glasgow. You mind I tell ye about it. He laid me out, and it's my turn to do the same with him. I had a notion I was going to make a nicht of it. There's naebody can hit Geordie Hamilton without Geordie getting his ain back some day. Get up, man, for I'm going to knock the head off ye." I duly got up, and with the best composure I could muster, looked him in the face. "You're mistaken, my friend. I never clapped eyes on you before, and I never was in Glasgow in my life." "That's the damned lee," said the Fusilier. "You're the man, and if you know, you're like enough him for to need a hiding." "Confound your nonsense," I said. "I've no quarrel with you, and I've better things to do than be scrapping with a stranger in a public house." "Have you, say? Well, I'll larn ye better. I'm going to hit ye, and then you'll have to fecht whether you want to or no. Tam, haud my jacket, and see that my drink's no scaled." This was an infernal nuisance, for a row here would bring in the police, and my dubious position would be laid bare. I thought of putting up a fight, for I was certain I could lay out the Jock a second time, but the worst of it was that I did not know where the thing would end. I might have to fight the lot of them, and that meant a noble public shindy. I did my best to speak my opponent fair. I said we were all good friends, and offered to stand drinks for the party. But the Fusilier's blood was up, and he was spoiling for a row, ably abetted by his comrades. He had his tunic off now, and was stamping in front of me with doubled fists. I did the best thing I could think of in the circumstances. My seat was close to the steps which led to the other part of the inn. I grabbed my hat, darted up them, and before they realized what I was doing, had bolted the door behind me. I could hear pandemonium break loose in the bar. I slipped down a dark passage to another which ran at right angles to it, and which seemed to connect the street door of the inn itself with the back premises. I could hear voices in the little hall, and that stopped me short. One of them was Linkletter's, but he was not talking as Linkletter had talked. He was speaking educated English. I heard another with a Scots accent, which I took to be the landlord's, and a third which sounded like some superior sort of constable's, very prompt and official. I heard one phrase, too, from Linkletter. "He calls himself McCaskey." Then they stopped, for the turmoil from the bar had reached the front door. The Fusilier and his friends were looking for me by the other entrance. The attention of the men in the hall was distracted, and that gave me a chance. There was nothing for it but the back door. I slipped through it into a courtyard and almost tumbled over a tub of water. I planted the thing so that anyone coming that way would fall over it. A door led me into an empty stable, and from that into a lane. It was all absurdly easy, but as I started down the lane I heard a mighty row and the sound of angry voices. Someone had gone into the tub, and I hoped it was Linkletter. I had taken a liking to that Fusilier Jock. There was the beginning of a moon somewhere, but that lane was very dark. I ran to the left, for on the right it looked like a cul-de-sac. That brought me into a quiet road of two-storied cottages, which showed at one end the lights of a street. So I took the other way, for I wasn't going to have the whole population of Muirtown on the hue and cry after me. I came into a country lane, and I also came into the van of the pursuit, which must have taken a short-cut. They shouted when they saw me, but I had a small start and legged it down that road in the belief that I was making for open country. That was where I was wrong. The road took me round to the other side of the town, and just when I was beginning to think I had a fair chance, I saw before me the lights of a signal box, and a little to the left of it the lights of the station. In half an hour's time the Edinburgh train would be leaving, but I had made that impossible. Behind me I could hear the pursuers, giving tongue like hound puppies, for they had attracted some pretty drunken gentlemen to their party. I was badly puzzled where to turn, when I noticed outside the station a long line of blurred lights, which could only mean a train with the carriage blinds down. It had an engine attached and seemed to be waiting for the addition of a couple of trucks to start. It was a wild chance, but the only one I saw. I scrambled across a piece of waste ground, climbed an embankment, and found myself on the metals. I ducked under the couplings and got on the far side of the train, away from the enemy. Then, simultaneously, two things happened. I heard the yells of my pursuers a dozen yards off, and the train jolted into motion. I jumped on the footboard and looked into an open window. The compartment was packed with troops, 6 aside and 2 men sitting on the floor, and the door was locked. I dived head foremost through the window and landed on the neck of a weary warrior who had just dropped off to sleep. While I was falling, I made up my mind on my conduct. I must be intoxicated, for I knew the infinite sympathy of the British soldier towards those thus overtaken. They pulled me to my feet, and the man I had descended on rubbed his skull and blasphemously demanded explanations. "Gentlemen," I hiccuped, "apologize. I was late for this blighted train, and I must be in Edinburgh tomorrow, or I get the sack. I apologize for it. If I've hurt my friend's head, I'll kiss it and make it well." At this there was a great laugh. "Ye'd better accept, Pete," said one. "It's the first time anybody ever offered to kiss your ugly head." A man asked me who I was, and I appeared to be searching for a card case. "Lost," I groaned. "Lost, and so's my wee bag. I've bashed my poor hat. I'm an awful sight, gentlemen, an awful warning to be in time for trains. I'm John Johnston, managing clerk to Messrs. Waters, Brown and Elphiston, 923 Charles Street, Edinburgh. I've been up north seeing my mamma." "You should be in France," said one man. "Wished I was, but they wouldn't let me. Mr. Johnston, they said, you're no damn good. Ye've varicose veins and a bad heart, they said. So I says, good morning, gentlemen. Don't blame me if the country's ruined. That's what I said." I had by this time occupied the only remaining space left on the floor. With the philosophy of their race, the men had accepted my presence and were turning again to their own talk. The train had got up speed, and as I judged it to be a special of some kind, I looked for few stoppings. Moreover, it was not a corridor carriage, but one of the old-fashioned kind, so I was safe for a time from the unwelcome attention of conductors. I stretched my legs below the seat, rested my head against the knees of a brawny gunner, and settled down to make the best of it. My reflections were not pleasant. I had got down too far below the surface, and had the naked feeling you get in a dream when you think you have gone to the theatre in your nightgown. I had had 3 names in 2 days, and as many characters. I felt as if I had no home or position anywhere, and was only a stray dog with everybody's hand and foot against me. It was an ugly sensation, and it was not redeemed by any acute fear or any knowledge of being mixed up in some desperate drama. I knew I could easily go on to Edinburgh, and when the police made trouble, as they would, a wire to Scotland Yard would settle matters in a couple of hours. There wasn't a suspicion of bodily danger to restore my dignity. The worst that could happen would be that Ivery would hear of my being befriended by the authorities, and the part I had settled to play would be impossible. He would certainly hear. I had the greatest respect for his intelligence service. Yet that was bad enough. So far I had done well. I had put Gresson off the scent. I had found out what Bullivant wanted to know, and I had only to return unostentatiously to London to have won out on the game. I told myself all that, but it didn't cheer my spirits. I was feeling mean and hunted and very cold about the feet. But I have a tough knuckle of obstinacy in me which makes me unwilling to give up a thing till I am fairly choked off it. The chances were badly against me. The Scottish police were actively interested in my movements and would be ready to welcome me at my journey's end. I had ruined my hat, and my clothes, as Amos had observed, were not respectable. I had got rid of a 4 days' beard the night before, but had cut myself in the process, and what with my weather-beaten face and tangled hair, looked liker a tinker than a decent bagman. I thought with longing of my portmanteau in the Pentland Hotel, Edinburgh, and the neat blue serge suit, and the clean linen that reposed in it. It was no case for a subtle game, for I held no cards. Still, I was determined not to chuck in my hand till I was forced to. If the train stopped anywhere, I would get out, and trust to my own wits and the standing luck of the British Army for the rest. The chance came just after dawn, when we halted at a little junction. I got up yawning and tried to open the door, till I remembered it was locked. Thereupon I stuck my legs out of the window on the side away from the platform, and was immediately seized upon by a sleepy Seaforth who thought I contemplated suicide. "Let me go," I said. "I'll be back in a jiffy." "Let him gang, Jock," said another voice. "You ken what a man's like when he's been on the bash. The cold air'll sober him." I was released, and after some gymnastics dropped on the metals and made my way round the rear of the train. As I clambered on the platform it began to move, and a face looked out of one of the back carriages. It was Linklater, and he recognized me. He tried to get out, but the door was promptly slammed by an indignant porter. I heard him protest, and he kept his head out till the train went round the curve. That cooked my goose all right. He would wire the police from the next station. Meantime, in that clean, bare, chilly place, there was only one traveller. He was a slim young man with a kit bag and a gun case. His clothes were beautiful, a green Homburg hat, a smart green tweed overcoat, and boots as brightly polished as a horse chestnut. I caught his profile as he gave up his ticket, and to my amazement I recognized it. The station master looked askance at me as I presented myself, dilapidated and dishevelled, to the official gaze. I tried to speak in a tone of authority. "Who is the man who has just gone out?" "Where's your ticket?" "I had no time to get one at Muirtown, and as you see I have left my luggage behind me. Take it out of that pound and I'll come back for the change. I want to know if that was Sir Archibald Roylance." He looked suspiciously at the note. "I think that's the name. He's a captain up at the Fleein' School. What was ye wanted with him?" I charged through the booking office and found my man about to enter a big grey motor car. "Archie!" I cried, and beat him on the shoulders. He turned round sharply. "What the devil? Who are you?" And then recognition crept into his face and he gave a joyous shout. "My holy aunt! The General disguised as Charlie Chaplin! Can I drive you anywhere, sir?" End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Mr. Standfast. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. I Take the Wings of a Dove. "Drive me somewhere to breakfast, Archie," I said, "for I'm perishing hungry." He and I got into the tonneau, and the driver swung us out of the station road, up a long incline of hill. Sir Archie had been one of my subalterns in the old Lennox Highlanders, and had left us before the Somme to join the Flying Corps. I heard that he had got his wings and had done well before Arras, and was now training pilots at home. He had been a light-hearted youth, who had endured a good deal of rough tonguing from me for his sins of omission. But it was the casual class of lad I was looking for now. I saw him steal amused glances at my appearance. "Been seeing a bit of life, sir?" he inquired respectfully. "I'm being hunted by the police," I said. "Dirty dogs! But don't worry, sir, we'll get you off all right. I've been in the same fix myself. You can lie snug in my little log hut, for that old image Gibbons won't blab. Or, tell you what, I've got an aunt who lives near here, and she's a bit of a sportsman. You can hide in her moated grange till the bobbies get tired." I think it was Archie's calm acceptance of my position as natural and becoming that restored my good temper. He was far too well bred to ask what crime I had committed, and I didn't propose to enlighten him much. But as we swung up the moorland road, I let him know that I was serving the government, but that it was necessary that I should appear to be unauthenticated, and that therefore I must dodge the police. He whistled his appreciation. "Gad, that's a deep game. Sort of camouflage? Speaking from my experience, it is easy to overdo that kind of stunt. When I was at Misieux, the French started out to camouflage the caravans where they kept their pigeons, and they did it so damned well that the poor little birds couldn't hit 'em off, and spent the night out." We entered the white gates of a big aerodrome, skirted a forest of tents and huts, and drew up at a shanty on the far confines of the place. The hour was 4:30, and the world was still asleep. Archie nodded towards one of the hangars, from the mouth of which projected the propeller end of an aeroplane. "I'm by way of flying that bus down to Farnton tomorrow," he remarked. "It's the new Shark Gladys, got a mouth like a tree." An idea flashed into my mind. "You're going this morning," I said. "How did you know?" he exclaimed. "I'm due to go today, but the grouse up in Caithness wanted shooting so badly that I decided to wangle another day's leave. They can't expect a man to start for the south of England when he's just off a frowsy journey." "All the same, you're going to be a stout fellow and start in 2 hours' time, and you're going to take me with you." He stared blankly, then burst into a roar of laughter. "You're the man to go tiger shooting with. But what price my commandant? He's not a bad chap, but a trifle shaggy about the fetlocks. He won't appreciate the joke." "He needn't know. He mustn't know. This is an affair between you and me till it's finished. I promise you I'll make it all square with the Flying Corps. Get me down to Farnton before evening, and you'll have done a good piece of work for your country." "Right-o! Let's have a tub and a bit of breakfast, and then I'm your man. I'll tell them to get the bus ready." In Archie's bedroom I washed and shaved, and borrowed a green tweed cap and a brand new aquascutum. The latter covered the deficiencies of my raiment, and when I commandeered a pair of gloves I felt almost respectable. Gibbons, who seemed to be a jack of all trades, cooked us some bacon and an omelette, and as he ate Archie yarned. In the battalion his conversation had been mostly of race meetings and the forsaken delights of town, but now he had forgotten all that, and like every good airman I have ever known, wallowed enthusiastically in shop. I have a deep respect for the Flying Corps, but it is apt to change its jargon every month, and its conversation is hard for the layman to follow. He was desperately keen about the war, which he saw wholly from the viewpoint of the air. Arras to him was over before the infantry crossed the top, and the tough bit of the Somme was October, not September. He calculated that the big air fighting had not come along yet, and all he hoped for was to be allowed out to France to have his share in it. Like all good airmen, he was very modest about himself. "I've done a bit of steeple-chasing and hunting, and I've good hands for a horse, so I can handle a bus fairly well. It's all a matter of hands, you know. There ain't half the risk of the infantry down below you, and 1,000,000 times the fun. Jolly glad I changed, sir." We talked of Peter, and he put him about top. Voss, he thought, was the only Boche that could compare with him, for he hadn't made up his mind about Lensch. The Frenchman Guillemet he ranked high, but in a different way. I remember he had no respect for Richthofen and his celebrated circus. At 6 sharp we were ready to go. A couple of mechanics had got out the machine, and Archie put on his coat and gloves and climbed into the pilot's seat, while I squeezed in behind in the observer's place. The aerodrome was waking up, but I saw no officers about. We were scarcely seated when Gibbons called our attention to a motor car on the road, and presently we heard a shout and saw men waving in our direction. "Better get off, my lad," I said. "These look like my friends." The engine started and the mechanic stood clear. As we taxied over the turf I looked back and saw several figures running in our direction. The next second we had left the bumpy earth for the smooth highroad of the air. I had flown several dozen times before, generally over the enemy lines when I wanted to see for myself how the land lay. Then we had flown low and had been nicely dusted by the Hun Archies, not to speak of an occasional machine gun. But never till that hour had I realized the joy of a straight flight in a swift plane in perfect weather. Archie didn't lose time. Soon the hangars behind looked like a child's toys, and the world ran away from us till it seemed like a great golden bowl spilling over with the quintessence of light. The air was cold and my hands numbed, but I never felt them. As we throbbed and tore southward, sometimes bumping in eddies, sometimes swimming evenly in a stream of motionless ether, my head and heart grew as light as a boy's. I forgot all about the vexations of my job and saw only its joyful comedy. I didn't think that anything on earth could worry me again. Far to the left was a wedge of silver, and behind it a cluster of toy houses. That must be Edinburgh, where reposed my portmanteau, and where a most efficient police force was now inquiring for me. At the thought I laughed so loud that Archie must have heard me. He turned round, saw my grinning face, and grinned back. Then he signalled to me to strap myself in. I obeyed, and he proceeded to practise stunts, the loop, the spinning nosedive, and others I didn't even know the names of. It was glorious fun, and he handled his machine as a good rider coaxes a nervous horse over a stiff hurdle. He had that extra something in his blood that makes the great pilot. Presently the chessboard of green and brown had changed to a deep purple with faint silvery lines like veins in a rock. We were crossing the Border Hills, the place where I had legged it for weary days when I was mixed up in the Black Stone business. What a marvellous element was this air, which took one far above the fatigues of humanity. Archie had done well to change. Peter had been the wise man. I felt a tremendous pity for my old friend hobbling about a German prison yard when he had once flown a hawk. I reflected that I had wasted my life hitherto. And then I remembered that all this glory had only one use in war, and that was to help the muddy British infantryman to down his Hun opponent. He was the fellow, after all, that decided battles, and the thought comforted me. A great exhilaration is often the precursor of disaster, and mine was to have a sudden downfall. It was getting on for noon, and we were well into England. I guessed from the rivers we had passed that we were somewhere in the north of Yorkshire, when the machine began to make odd sounds, and we bumped in perfectly calm patches of air. We dived and then climbed, but the confounded thing kept sputtering. Archie passed back a slip of paper on which he had scribbled, "Engine conked. Must land at Micklegill. Very sorry." So we dropped to a lower elevation where we could see clearly the houses and roads and the long swelling ridges of a moorland country. I could never have found my way about, but Archie's practised eye knew every landmark. We were trundling along very slowly now, and even I was soon able to pick up the hangars of a big aerodrome. We made Micklegill, but only by the skin of our teeth. We were so low that the smoky chimneys of the city of Bradfield, 7 miles to the east, were half hidden by a ridge of down. Archie achieved a clever descent in the lee of a belt of firs, and got out full of imprecations against the Gladys engine. "I'll go up to the camp and report," he said, "and send mechanics down to tinker this darned gramophone. You'd better go for a walk, sir. I don't want to answer questions about you till we're ready to start. I reckon it'll be about an hour's job." The cheerfulness I had acquired in the upper air still filled me. I sat down in a ditch as merry as a sandboy and lit a pipe. I was possessed by a boyish spirit of casual adventure, and waited on the next turn of fortune's wheel with only a pleasant amusement. That turn was not long in coming. Archie appeared very breathless. "Look here, sir, there's the deuce of a row up there. They've been wiring about you all over the country, and they know you're with me. They've got the police, and they'll have you in 5 minutes if you don't leg it. I lied like Billy-O and said I had never heard of you, but they're coming to see for themselves. For God's sake, get off. You'd better keep in cover down that hollow and round the back of these trees. I'll stay here and try to brazen it out. I'll get strafed to blazes anyhow. I hope you'll get me out of the scrape, sir." "Don't you worry, my lad," I said. "I'll make it all square when I get back to town. I'll make for Bradfield, for this place is a bit conspicuous. Goodbye, Archie, you're a good chap and I'll see you don't suffer. I started off down the hollow of the moor, trying to make speed atone for lack of strategy, for it was hard to know how much my pursuers commanded from that higher ground. They must have seen me, for I heard whistles blown and men's cries. I struck a road, crossed it, and passed a ridge from which I had a view of Bradfield 6 miles off. And as I ran I began to reflect that this kind of chase could not last long. They were bound to round me up in the next half hour unless I could puzzle them. But in that bare, green place there was no cover, and it looked as if my chances were pretty much those of a hare coursed by a good greyhound on a naked moor. Suddenly, from just in front of me, came a familiar sound. It was the roar of guns, the slam of field batteries, and the boom of small howitzers. I wondered if I had gone off my head. As I plodded on, the rattle of machine guns was added, and over the ridge before me I saw the dust and fumes of bursting shells. I concluded that I was not mad, and that therefore the Germans must have landed. I crawled up the last slope, quite forgetting the pursuit behind me. And then I'm blessed if I did not look down on a veritable battle. There were 2 sets of trenches, with barbed wire and all the fixings, one set filled with troops and the other empty. On these latter shells were bursting, but there was no sign of life in them. In the other lines there seemed the better part of 2 brigades, and the first trench was stiff with bayonets. My first thought was that home forces had gone dotty, for this kind of show could have no sort of training value. And then I saw other things, cameras and cameramen on platforms on the flanks, and men with megaphones behind them on wooden scaffoldings. One of the megaphones was going full blast all the time. I saw the meaning of the performance at last. Some movie merchant had got a graft with the government, and troops had been turned out to make a war film. It occurred to me that if I were mixed up in that push, I might get the cover I was looking for. I scurried down the hill to the nearest cameraman. As I ran, the first wave of troops went over the top. They did it uncommon well, for they entered into the spirit of the thing, and went over with grim faces in that slow, purposeful lope that I had seen in my own fellows at Arras. Smoke grenades burst among them, and now and then some resourceful mountebank would roll over. Altogether it was about the best show I have ever seen. The cameras clicked, the guns banged, a background of Boy Scouts applauded, and the dust rose in billows to the sky. But all the same, something was wrong. I could imagine that this kind of business took a good deal of planning from the point of view of the movie merchant, for his purpose was not the same as that of the officer in command. You know how a photographer finicks about and is dissatisfied with a pose that seems all right to his sitter. I should have thought the spectacle enough to get any cinema audience off their feet, but the man on the scaffolding near me judged differently. He made his megaphone boom like the swan song of a dying buffalo. He wanted to change something and didn't know how to do it. He hopped on one leg, he took the megaphone from his mouth to curse, he waved it like a banner and yelled at some opposite number on the other flank. And then his patience forsook him, and he skipped down the ladder, dropping his megaphone past the cameramen onto the battlefield. That was his undoing. He got in the way of the second wave and was swallowed up like a leaf in a torrent. For a moment I saw a red face and a loud checked suit, and the rest was silence. He was carried on over the hill or rolled into an enemy trench, but anyhow he was lost to my ken. I bagged his megaphone and hopped up the steps to the platform. At last I saw a chance of first-class cover, for with Archie's coat and cap I made a very good appearance as a movie merchant. 2 waves had gone over the top, and the cinema men, working like beavers, had filmed the lot. But there was still a fair amount of troops to play with, and I determined to tangle up that outfit so that the fellows who were after me would have better things to think about. My advantage was that I knew how to command men. I could see that my opposite number with the megaphone was helpless, for the mistake which had swept my man into a shell hole had reduced him to impotence. The troops seemed to be mainly in charge of NCOs. I could imagine that the officers would try to shirk this business, and an NCO is the most literal creature on earth. So with my megaphone I proceeded to change the battle order. I brought up the third wave to the front trenches. In about 3 minutes the men had recognized the professional touch and were moving smartly to my orders. They thought it was part of the show, and the obedient cameras clicked at everything that came into their orbit. My aim was to deploy the troops on too narrow a front, so that they were bound to fan outward, and I had to be quick about it, for I didn't know when the hapless movie merchant might be retrieved from the battlefield and dispute my authority. It takes a long time to straighten a thing out, but it does not take long to tangle it, especially when the thing is so delicate a machine as disciplined troops. In about 8 minutes I had produced chaos. The flanks spread out, in spite of all the shepherding of the NCOs, and the fringe engulfed the photographers. The cameras on their little platforms went down like ninepins. It was solemn to see the startled face of a photographer, taken unawares, supplicating the purposeful infantry before he was swept off his feet into speechlessness. It was no place for me to linger in, so I chucked away the megaphone and got mixed up with the tail of the third wave. I was swept on and came to anchor in the enemy trenches, where I found, as I expected, my profane and breathless predecessor, the movie merchant. I had nothing to say to him, so I stuck to the trench till it ended against the slope of the hill. On that flank, delirious with excitement, stood a knot of Boy Scouts. My business was to get to Bradfield as quickly as my legs would take me, and as inconspicuously as the gods would permit. Unhappily, I was far too great an object of interest to that nursery of heroes. Every Boy Scout is an amateur detective and hungry for knowledge. I was followed by several who plied me with questions, and were told that I was off to Bradfield to hurry up part of the cinema outfit. It sounded lame enough, for that cinema outfit was already past praying for. We reached the road, and against a stone wall stood several bicycles. I selected one and prepared to mount. "That's Mr. Emmett's machine," said one boy sharply. "He told me to keep an eye on it." "I must borrow it, sonny," I said. "Mr. Emmett's my very good friend and won't object." From the place where we stood I overlooked the back of the battlefield and could see an anxious congress of officers. I could see others, too, whose appearance I did not like. They had not been there when I operated on the megaphone. They must have come downhill from the aerodrome, and in all likelihood were the pursuers I had avoided. The exhilaration which I had won in the air, and which had carried me into the tomfoolery of the past half hour, was ebbing. I had the hunted feeling once more, and grew middle-aged and cautious. I had a baddish record for the day, what with getting Archie into a scrape and busting up an official cinema show, neither consistent with the duties of a brigadier-general. Besides, I had still to get to London. I had not gone 200 yards down the road when a Boy Scout, pedalling furiously, came up abreast me. "Colonel Edgeworth wants to see you," he panted. "You're to come back at once." "Tell him I can't wait now," I said. "I'll pay my respects to him in an hour." "He said you were to come at once," said the faithful messenger. "He's in an awful temper with you, and he's got bobbies with him." I put on pace and left the boy behind. I reckoned I had the better part of 2 miles start, and could beat anything except petrol. But my enemies were bound to have cars, so I had better get off the road as soon as possible. I coasted down a long hill to a bridge which spanned a small discoloured stream that flowed in a wooded glen. There was nobody for the moment on the hill behind me, so I slipped into the covert, shoved the bicycle under the bridge, and hid Archie's aquascutum in a bramble thicket. I was now in my own disreputable tweeds, and I hoped that the shedding of my most conspicuous garment would puzzle my pursuers if they should catch up with me. But this I was determined they should not do. I made good going down that stream and out into a lane which led from the downs to the market gardens round the city. I thanked heaven I had got rid of the aquascutum, for the August afternoon was warm and my pace was not leisurely. When I was in secluded ground I ran, and when anyone was in sight I walked smartly. As I went I reflected that Bradfield would see the end of my adventures. The police knew that I was there, and would watch the stations and hunt me down if I lingered in the place. I knew no one out there, and had no chance of getting an effective disguise. Indeed, I very soon began to wonder if I should get even as far as the streets. For at the moment when I had got a lift on the back of a fishmonger's cart, and was screened by its flapping canvas, 2 figures passed by on motor bicycles, and one of them was the inquisitive Boy Scout. The main road from the aerodrome was probably now being patrolled by motor cars. It looked as if there would be a degrading arrest in one of the suburbs. The fish cart, helped by half a crown to the driver, took me past the outlying small villadom, between long lines of workmen's houses, to narrow cobbled lanes and the purlieus of great factories. As soon as I saw the streets well crowded, I got out and walked. In my old clothes I must have appeared like some second-class bookie or seedy horse-coper. The only respectable thing I had about me was my gold watch. I looked at the time and found it 5:30. I wanted food and was casting about for an eating-house when I heard the purr of a motorcycle and across the road saw the intelligent Boy Scout. He saw me, too, and put on the brake with a sharpness which caused him to skid and all but come to grief under the wheels of a wool wagon. That gave me time to efface myself by darting up a side street. I had an unpleasant sense that I was about to be trapped, for in a place I knew nothing of, I had not a chance to use my wits. I remember trying feverishly to think, and I suppose that my preoccupation made me careless. I was now in a veritable slum, and when I put my hand to my vest pocket, I found that my watch had gone. That put the top stone on my depression. The reaction from the wild burnout of the forenoon had left me very cold about the feet. I was getting into the underworld again, and there was no chance of a second Archie Roylance turning up to rescue me. I remember yet the sour smell of the factories and the mist of smoke in the evening air. It is a smell I have never met since without a sort of dulling of spirit. Presently I came out into a marketplace. Whistles were blowing, and there was a great hurrying of people back from the mills. The crowd gave me a momentary sense of security, and I was just about to inquire my way to the railway station when someone jostled my arm. A rough-looking fellow in mechanic's clothes was beside me. "Mate," he whispered, "I got summat of yours here." And to my amazement he slipped my watch into my hand. "It was took by mistake. We're friends of yours. You're right enough if you do what I tell you. There's a peeler over there got his eye on you. Follow me and I'll get you off." I didn't much like the man's looks, but I had no choice, and anyhow he had given me back my watch. He sidled into an alley between tall houses, and I sidled after him. Then he took to his heels and led me a twisting course through smelly courts into a tan-yard, and then by a narrow lane to the back quarters of a factory. Twice we doubled back, and once we climbed a wall and followed the bank of a blue-black stream with a filthy scum on it. Then we got into a very mean quarter of the town, and emerged in a dingy garden strewn with tin cans and broken flower-pots. By a back door we entered one of the cottages, and my guide very carefully locked it behind him. He lit the gas and drew the blinds in a small parlour, and looked at me long and quizzically. He spoke now in an educated voice. "I ask no questions," he said, "but it's my business to put my services at your disposal. You carry the passport." I stared at him, and he pulled out his watch and showed a white and purple cross inside the lid. "I don't defend all the people we employ," he said, grinning. "Men's morals are not always as good as their patriotism. One of them pinched your watch, and when he saw what was inside it, he reported to me. We soon picked up your trail and observed you were in a bit of trouble. As I say, I ask no questions. What can we do for you?" "I want to get to London without any questions asked. They're looking for me in my present rig, so I've got to change it." "That's easy enough," he said. "Make yourself comfortable for a little and I'll fix you up. The night train goes at 11:30. You'll find cigars in the cupboard, and there's this week's Critic on the table. It's got a good article on Conrad, if you care for such things." I helped myself to a cigar and spent a profitable half-hour reading about the vices of the British government. Then my host returned and bade me ascend to his bedroom. "You're Private Henry Tompkins of the 12th Gloucesters, and you'll find your clothes ready for you. I'll send on your present togs if you give me an address." I did as I was bid, and presently emerged in the uniform of a British private, complete down to the shapeless boots and the dropsical puttees. Then my friend took me in hand and finished the transformation. He started on my hair with scissors and arranged a lock which, when well oiled, curled over my forehead. My hands were hard and rough and only needed some grubbiness and hacking about the nails to pass muster. With my cap on the side of my head, a pack on my back, a service rifle in my hands, and my pockets bursting with penny picture papers, I was the very model of the British soldier returning from leave. I had also a packet of Woodbine cigarettes and a hunch of bread and cheese for the journey. And I had a railway warrant made out in my name for London. Then my friend gave me supper, bread and cold meat and a bottle of Bass, which I wolfed savagely, for I had had nothing since breakfast. He was a curious fellow, as discreet as a tombstone, very ready to speak about general subjects, but never once coming near the intimate business which had linked him and me, and heaven knows how many others, by means of a little purple and white cross in a watch case. I remember we talked about the topics that used to be popular at Biggleswick, the big political things that begin with capital letters. He took Amos's view of the soundness of the British working man, but he said something which made me think. He was convinced that there was a tremendous lot of German spy work about, and that most of the practitioners were innocent. The ordinary Briton doesn't run to treason, but he's not very bright. A clever man in that kind of game can make better use of a fool than a rogue. As he saw me off, he gave me a piece of advice. Get out of these clothes as soon as you reach London. Private Tompkins will frank you out of Bradfield, but it mightn't be a healthy alias in the metropolis. At 11:30 I was safe in the train, talking the jargon of the returning soldier, with half a dozen of my own type in a smoky third-class carriage. I had been lucky in my escape, for at the station entrance and on the platform I had noticed several men with the unmistakable look of plainclothes police. Also, though this may have been my fancy, I thought I caught in the crowd a glimpse of the bagman who had called himself Linkletter. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Mr. Standfast by John Buchan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. The Advantages of an Air Raid. The train was abominably late. It was due at 8:27, but it was nearly 10 when we reached St. Pancras. I had resolved to go straight to my rooms in Westminster, buying on the way a cap and waterproof to conceal my uniform should any one be near my door on my arrival. Then I would ring up Blenkiron and tell him all my adventures. I breakfasted at a coffee stall, left my pack and rifle in the cloakroom, and walked out into the clear sunny morning. I was feeling very pleased with myself. Looking back on my madcap journey, I seemed to have had an amazing run of luck, and to be entitled to a little credit too. I told myself that persistence always pays, and that nobody is beaten till he is dead. All Blenkiron's instructions had been faithfully carried out. I had found Ivory's post office. I had laid the lines of our own special communications with the enemy, and so far as I could see, I had left no clue behind me. Ivory and Gresson took me for a well-meaning nincompoop. It was true that I had aroused profound suspicion in the breasts of the Scottish police. But that mattered nothing, for Cornelius Brand, the suspect, would presently disappear, and there was nothing against the rising soldier, Brigadier-General Richard Hannay, who would soon be on his way to France. After all, this piece of service had not been so very unpleasant. I laughed when I remembered my grim forebodings in Gloucestershire. Bullivant had said it would be damnably risky in the long run, but here was the end, and I had never been in danger of anything worse than making a fool of myself. I remember that as I made my way through Bloomsbury, I was not thinking so much of my triumphant report to Blenkiron as of my speedy return to the front. Soon I would be with my beloved brigade again. I had missed Messines and the first part of 3rd Ypres, but the battle was still going on, and I had yet a chance. I might get a division, for there had been talk of that before I left. I knew the army commander thought a lot of me, but on the whole I hoped I would be left with the brigade. After all, I was an amateur soldier, and I wasn't certain of my powers with a bigger command. In Charing Cross Road I thought of Mary, and the brigade seemed suddenly less attractive. I hoped the war wouldn't last much longer, though with Russia heading straight for the devil, I didn't know how it was going to stop very soon. I was determined to see Mary before I left, and I had a good excuse, for I had taken my orders from her. The prospect entranced me, and I was mooning along in a happy dream when I collided violently with an agitated citizen. Then I realised something very odd was happening. There was a dull sound like the popping of the corks of flat soda-water bottles. There was a humming, too, from very far up in the skies. People in the street were either staring at the heavens or running wildly for shelter. A motor bus in front of me emptied its contents in a twinkling. A taxi pulled up with a jar, and the driver and the fare dived into a second-hand bookshop. It took me a moment or two to realise the meaning of it all, and I had scarcely done this when I got a very practical proof. 100 yards away a bomb fell on a street island, shivering every window pane in a wide radius, and sending splinters of stone flying about my head. I did what I had done 100 times before at the front, and dropped flat on my face. The man who says he doesn't mind being bombed or shelled is either a liar or a maniac. This London air raid seemed to me a singularly unpleasant business. I think it was the sight of the decent civilised life around one and the orderly streets, for what was perfectly natural in a rubble heap like Ypres, Arras, seemed like an outrage here. I remember once being in billets in a Flanders village where I had the mayor's house, and sat in a room upholstered in cut velvet with wax flowers on the mantelpiece and oil paintings of 3 generations on the walls. The Boche took it into his head to shell the place with a long-range naval gun, and I simply loathed it. It was horrible to have dust and splinters blown into that snug, homely room, whereas if I had been in a ruined barn I wouldn't have given the thing 2 thoughts. In the same way, bombs dropping in central London seemed a grotesque indecency. I hated to see plump citizens with wild eyes, and nursemaids with scared children, and miserable women scuttling like rabbits in a warren. The drone grew louder, and looking up, I could see the enemy planes flying in a beautiful formation, very leisurely as it seemed, with all London at their mercy. Another bomb fell to the right, and presently bits of our own shrapnel were clattering viciously around me. I thought it about time to take cover, and ran shamelessly for the best place I could see, which was a tube station. 5 minutes before, the streets had been crowded. Now I left behind me a desert dotted with 1 bus and 3 empty taxicabs. I found the tube entrance filled with excited humanity. 1 stout lady had fainted and a nurse had become hysterical, but on the whole people were behaving well. Oddly enough, they did not seem inclined to go down the stairs to the complete security of underground, but preferred rather to collect where they could still get a glimpse of the upper world, as if they were torn between fear of their lives and interest in the spectacle. That crowd gave me a good deal of respect for my countrymen, but several were badly rattled, and one man a little way off, whose back was turned, kept twitching his shoulders as if he had the colic. I watched him curiously, and a movement of the crowd brought his face into profile. Then I gasped with amazement, for I saw that it was Ivory. And yet it was not Ivory. There were the familiar nondescript features, the blandness, the plumpness, but all, so to speak, in ruins. The man was in a blind funk. His features seemed to be dislimning before my eyes. He was growing sharper, finer, in a way younger, a man without grip on himself, a shapeless creature in process of transformation. He was being reduced to his rudiments. Under the spell of panic he was becoming a new man. And the crazy thing was that I knew the new man better than the old. My hands were jammed close to my sides by the crowd. I could scarcely turn my head, and it was not the occasion for one's neighbours to observe one's expression. If it had been, mine must have been a study. My mind was far away from air raids, back in the hot summer weather of 1914. I saw a row of villas perched on a headland above the sea. In the garden of one of them 2 men were playing tennis, while I was crouching behind an adjacent bush. One of these was a plump young man who wore a coloured scarf round his waist and babbled of golf handicaps. I saw him again at the villa dining room wearing a dinner jacket and lisping a little. I sat opposite him at bridge. I beheld him collared by 2 of Macgillivray's men when his comrade had rushed for the 39 steps that led to the sea. I saw, too, the sitting-room of my old flat in Portland Place, and heard little Scudder's quick, anxious voice talking about the 3 men he feared most on earth, one of whom lisped in his speech. I had thought that all three had long ago been laid under the turf. He was not looking my way, and I could devour his face in safety. There was no shadow of doubt. I had always put him down as the most amazing actor on earth, for had he not played the part of the First Sea Lord and deluded that officer's daily colleagues? But he could do far more than any human actor, for he could take on a new personality and with it a new appearance, and live steadily in the character as if he had been born in it. My mind was a blank, and I could only make blind gropings at conclusions. How had he escaped the death of a spy and murderer, for I had last seen him in the hands of justice? Of course he had known me from the first day in Biggleswick. I had thought to play with him, and he had played most cunningly and damnably with me. In that sweating sardine tin of refugees I shivered in the bitterness of my chagrin. And then I found his face turned to mine, and I knew that he recognized me. More, I knew that he knew that I had recognized him, not as Ivery, but as that other man. There came into his eyes a curious look of comprehension, which for a moment overcame his funk. I had sense enough to see that that put the final lid on it. There was still something doing if he believed that I was blind, but if he once thought that I knew the truth, he would be through our meshes and disappear like a fog. My first thought was to get at him and collar him and summon everybody to help me by denouncing him for what he was. Then I saw that that was impossible. I was a private soldier in a borrowed uniform, and he could easily turn the story against me. I must use surer weapons. I must get to Bullivant and Macgillivray and set their big machine to work. Above all, I must get to Blenkiron. I started to squeeze out of that push, for air raids now seemed far too trivial to give a thought to. Moreover, the guns had stopped, but so sheep-like is human nature that the crowd still hung together, and it took me a good 15 minutes to edge my way to the open air. I found that the trouble was over, and the street had resumed its usual appearance. Buses and taxis were running, and voluble knots of people were recounting their experiences. I started off for Blenkiron's bookshop as the nearest harbour of refuge. But in Piccadilly Circus I was stopped by a military policeman. He asked my name and battalion, and I gave him them, while his suspicious eye ran over my figure. I had no pack or rifle, and the crush in the tube station had not improved my appearance. I explained that I was going back to France that evening, and he asked for my warrant. I fancy my preoccupation made me nervous, and I lied badly. I said I had left it with my kit in the house of my married sister, but I fumbled in giving the address. I could see that the fellow did not believe a word of it. Just then up came an APM. He was a pompous dugout, very splendid in his red tabs, and probably bucked up at having just been under fire. Anyhow, he was out to walk in the strict path of duty. "Tompkins," he said, "Tompkins, we've got some fellow of that name on our records. Bring him along, Wilson." "But, sir," I said, I simply must meet my friend. It's urgent business, and I assure you I'm all right. If you don't believe me, I'll take a taxi and we'll go down to Scotland Yard, and I'll stand by what they say." His brow grew dark with wrath. "What infernal nonsense is this? Scotland Yard? What the devil has Scotland Yard to do with it? You're an impostor. I can see it in your face. I'll have your depot rung up and you'll be in jail in a couple of hours. I know a deserter when I see him. Bring him along, Wilson. You know what to do if he tries to bolt." I had a momentary thought of breaking away, but decided that the odds were too much against me. Fuming with impatience, I followed the APM to his office on the first floor in a side street. The precious minutes were slipping past. Ivery, now thoroughly warned, was making good his escape, and I, the sole repository of a deadly secret, was tramping in this absurd procession. The APM issued his orders. He gave instructions that my depot should be rung up, and he bade Wilson remove me to what he called the guard room. He sat down at his desk and busied himself with a mass of buff dockets. In desperation I renewed my appeal. "I implore you to telephone to Mr. Macgillivray at Scotland Yard. It's a matter of life and death, sir. You're taking a very big responsibility if you don't." I had hopelessly offended his brittle dignity. Any more of your insolence and I'll have you put in irons. I'll attend to you soon enough for your comfort. Get out of this till I send for you." As I looked at his foolish, irritable face, I realized that I was fairly up against it. Short of assault and battery on everybody, I was bound to submit. I saluted respectfully and was marched away. The hours I spent in that bare ante-room are like a nightmare in my recollection. A sergeant was busy at a desk with more buff dockets, and an orderly waited on a stool by a telephone. I looked at my watch and observed that it was 1 o'clock. Soon the slamming of a door announced that the APM had gone to lunch. I tried conversation with the fat sergeant, but he very soon shut me up. So I hunched up on the wooden form and chewed the cud of my vexation. I thought with bitterness of the satisfaction which had filled me in the morning. I had fancied myself the devil of a fine fellow, and I had been no more than a mountebank. The adventures of the past days seemed merely childish. I had been telling lies and cutting capers over half Britain, thinking I was playing a deep game, and I had only been behaving like a schoolboy. On such occasions a man is rarely just to himself, and the intensity of my self-abasement would have satisfied my worst enemy. It didn't console me that the futility of it all was not my blame. I was looking for excuses. It was the facts that cried out against me, and on the facts I had been an idiotic failure. For of course Ivery had played with me since the first day at Biggleswick. He had applauded my speeches and flattered me, and advised me to go to the Clyde, laughing at me all the time. Gresson, too, had known. Now I saw it all. He had tried to drown me between Colonsay and Mull. It was Gresson who had set the police on me in Morven. The bagman Linkletter had been one of Gresson's creatures. The only meagre consolation was that the gang had thought me dangerous enough to attempt to murder me, and that they knew nothing about my doings in Skye. Of that I was positive. They had marked me down, but for several days I had slipped clean out of their ken. As I went over all the incidents, I asked if everything was yet lost. I had failed to hoodwink Ivery, but I had found out his post office, and if he only believed I hadn't recognized him for the miscreant of the Black Stone, he would go on in his old ways and play into Blenkiron's hands. Yes, but I had seen him in undress, so to speak, and he knew that I had so seen him. The only thing now was to collar him before he left the country, for there was ample evidence to hang him on. The law must stretch out its long arm and collect him and Gresson and the Portuguese Jew, try them by court-martial, and put them decently underground. But he had now had more than an hour's warning, and I was entangled with red tape in this damned APM's office. The thought drove me frantic, and I got up and paced the floor. I saw the orderly, with rather a scared face, making ready to press the bell, and I noticed that the fat sergeant had gone to lunch. "Say, mate," I said, "don't you feel inclined to do a poor fellow a good turn? I know I'm for it all right, and I'll take my medicine like a lamb, but I want badly to put a telephone call through." "It ain't allowed," was the answer. "I get L from the old man." "But he's gone out," I urged. "I don't want you to do anything wrong, mate. I leave you to do the talking if you'll only send my message. I'm flush of money, and I don't mind handing you a quid for the job." He was a pinched little man with a weak chin, and he obviously wavered. "Who d'you want to talk to?" he asked. "Scotland Yard," I said, "the home of the police. Lord bless you, there can't be no harm in that. You've only got to ring up Scotland Yard, I'll give you the number, and give the message to Mr. Macgillivray. He's the head bummer of all the bobbies." "That sounds a bit of all right," he said. "The old man, he won't be back for 'alf an hour, nor the sergeant neither. Let's see your quid, though." I laid a £1 note on the form beside me. "It's yours, mate, if you get through to Scotland Yard and speak the piece I'm going to give you." He went over to the instrument. "What do you want to say to the bloke with the long name?" "Say that Richard Hannay is detained at the APM's office in Claxton Street. Say he's got important news. Say urgent and secret news, and ask Mr. Macgillivray to do something about it at once." "But Hannay ain't the name you gave." "Lord bless you, no. Did you never hear of a man borrowing another name? Anyhow, that's the one I want you to give." "But if this Mac man comes round here, they'll know he's been rung up, and I'll have the old man down on me." It took 10 minutes and a £2 note to get him past this hurdle. By and by he screwed up courage and rang up the number. I listened with some nervousness while he gave my message. He had to repeat it twice, and waited eagerly on the next words. "No, sir," I heard him say. "He don't want you to come round 'ere. He thinks as how, I mean to say, he wants—" I took a long stride and twitched the receiver from him. "Macgillivray," I said, "is that you? Richard Hannay. For the love of God, come round here this instant and deliver me from the clutches of a tomfool APM. I've got the most deadly news. There's not a second to waste. For God's sake, come quick." Then I added, "Just tell your fellows to gather Ivery in at once. You know his lairs." I hung up the receiver and faced a pale and indignant orderly. "It's all right," I said. "I promise you that you won't get into any trouble on my account, and there's your £2." The door in the next room opened and shut. The APM had returned from lunch. 10 minutes later the door opened again. I heard Macgillivray's voice, and it was not pitched in dulcet tones. He had run up against minor officialdom and was making hay with it. I was my own master once more, so I forsook the company of the orderly. I found a most rattled officer trying to save a few rags of his dignity, and the formidable figure of Macgillivray instructing him in manners. "Glad to see you, Dick," he said. "This is General Hannay, sir. It may comfort you to know that your folly may have made just the difference between your country's victory and defeat. I shall have a word to say to your superiors." It was hardly fair. I had to put in a word for the old fellow, whose red tab seemed suddenly to have grown dingy. "It was my blame wearing this kit. We'll call it a misunderstanding and forget it. But I would suggest that civility is not wasted even on a poor devil of a defaulting private soldier." Once in Macgillivray's car, I poured out my tale. "Tell me it's a nightmare," I cried. "Tell me that the 3 men we collected on the Ruff were shot long ago." "2," he replied, "but 1 escaped. Heaven knows how he managed it, but he disappeared clean out of the world." "The plump one who lisped in his speech?" Macgillivray nodded. "Well, we're in for it this time. Have you issued instructions?" "Yes. With luck we shall have our hands on him within an hour. We've our net round all his haunts." "But 2 hours' start! It's a big handicap, for you're dealing with a genius." "Yet I think we can manage it. Where are you bound for?" I told him my rooms in Westminster, and then to my old flat in Park Lane. "The day of disguises has passed. In half an hour I'll be Richard Hannay. It'll be a comfort to get into uniform again. Then I'll try look up Blenkiron." He grinned. "I gather you've had a riotous time. We've had a good many anxious messages from the north about a certain Mr. Brand. I couldn't discourage our men, for I fancied it might have spoiled your game. I heard that last night they had lost touch with you in Bradfield, so I rather expected to see you here today. Efficient body of men, the Scottish police." "Especially when they have various enthusiastic amateur helpers." "So?" he said. "Yes, of course. They would have. But I hope presently to congratulate you on the success of your mission." "I'll bet you a pony you don't," I said. "I never bet on a professional subject. Why this pessimism?" "Only that I know our gentleman better than you. I've been twice up against him. He's the kind of wicked that don't cease from troubling till they're stone dead. And even then I'd want to see the body cremated and take the ashes into mid-ocean and scatter them. I've got a feeling that he's the biggest thing you or I will ever tackle." End of Chapter 10.